Hello, everybody. Welcome to this program, this anti-racism program. I am Rick Chrisman. I'm the interim senior minister at the Eliot Church of Newton, which is a congregational church, United Church of Christ. And I have here with me my two partners, educators, journalists, and otherwise big supporters of getting people awakened to the very serious issues of racism in our country. Diane Wong is a lawyer, has a JD from Harvard Law School, and she tells me that she was born into a multiracial family, Black, Chinese, Mexican, Irish, Native American, and she grew up in Cleveland's Black community and attended a segregated school system, which to navigate was a challenge. Which it was a system that sought to undermine her sense of self and history. But she came out committed to pursuing racial justice through open dialogue, learning, and healing, and yoga too, it would seem, as well. And Pharaoh Saunders is here. Now, we were talking about the heat this week and what he was doing to avoid it, but he couldn't because he's a counselor at a camp for kids, and they're out doing their outdoor activities with not an awful lot of shade. But Pharaoh is a student at Bunker Hill, and he's about to finish his AA and plans to go on to a four-year college soon. I admire and respect both of these advocates for racial justice because of the programs they've already offered to people, and you'll get the sense of that and the evidence of it as we proceed. They have a program on racial resilience. I love that phrase. And also another one on wealth from slavery, which is a subject we'll probably turn to ourselves. So this is the first of a six-part series of quick dialogues, 15 to 20 minutes, that will touch on a half a dozen different subjects. So listen, today's topic is intended to uncover things you thought you knew, but really don't. Now, we've all heard of Jim Crow laws, and we know what Jim Crow laws did in the South in segregating Blacks and whites from each other. But did you know there were, before that, Black codes? So this is what we want to open up for starters, and we'll just follow our conversation to uncover as much of that as we can in a short compass. What were the Black codes? This was new to me when I saw it on your menu of topics, Pharaoh. What were the Black codes?
Well, the Black codes were sort of like a precursor, legally speaking, to the later Jim Crow laws. So they sort of came into the post-Civil War American South as a series of laws and restrictions that were placed on the newly freed African American population. Generally, when people sort of observe them in a historical context, because there is a lot of chronological overlap with the Jim Crow laws, people usually lump them together. Though there are some distinctions about certain things, sort of like how things are phrased particularly. Like, for example, with the Black codes, there's not an effort to try to make a sort of a superficial claim of separate but equal. That's not the point. So, like, that's a pretty clear way to distinguish between them in terms of just how these things are written. It's very blatantly just a straight up attack against the liberties of these newly freed now citizens of the United States, and they make no effort to even try to cover it up or hide it behind any sort of formality.
Well, and didn't this coincide with the fact that, of course, the formerly enslaved people were just tossed out onto the bosom of nature, to the land, with nothing to their name other than what they possibly brought with them from their living existence on the plantations.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Let me add something to that. It's something for all of us to keep in mind. When there was the whole Civil War that was in large part fought over keeping the Black people enslaved forever. There was never an intention that it was going to be temporary. It was becoming, it had already become chattel slavery, and they had changed it so that it was the condition of the mother that that controlled the condition of the child. You know, in most of Western culture, it's the father, and the father has responsibility for the children. But that was changed so that it was the condition of the mother. So that meant that if your mother is enslaved, you're not only, even if your father is the plantation owner, you're not only enslaved then, you're enslaved for life. So that what happened after the Civil War, the South wanted to keep Black people. They needed to have labor, and they were very comfortable. They created all these new laws that only pertained to Black people, and they were petty things that they made criminal behavior. And they did that because, and we'll talk about that soon, because of the 13th Amendment, the loophole that allowed for the enslavement for those who had committed crime. So they made things criminal, and they started to arrest Black people.
Right. Well, this is something that grew worse and worse with the advent of lynching, which was the non-legal device by which white society enforced these codes of separation, and it became it developed to the level of being outright terrorism. But this was not legal, of course. This was extrajudicial attempt to keep African Americans, the formerly enslaved, in a state of complete imprisonment.
It was extrajudicial, though. There was usually in these circumstances, in the sort of time periods that we're talking about, which do extend much farther than many people tend to consider, either just blatant disregard for investigation of these things, which were technically crimes, like you said, they're definitely extrajudicial, or even corroboration with forces that would perpetrate things like this, beyond just turning a blind eye to them.
Well, I wanted to add too, just at that point, Pharaoh, that the result was that you had in Southern society a police state that did not require an army or a militia or a police force, because the whole white population basically was the enforcer through the terrorism of these lynchings and the threat of it. What about today? One thing that we've been educated by a great deal. One book that has educated me was Michelle Alexander's *The New Jim Crow*, and where she describes that the penal system, our judicial system that incarcerates so many African Americans, for one thing, has the effect of sending former inmates out into the world, and now they're not just marked by the color of their skin, which theoretically, legally, we are not to discriminate against, but now they have the stigma of having been convicted and served time, and that this goes on their permanent record. After all, one of the first questions on any employment application is, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Mm-hmm. And so with so many African American males going through the prison system and coming out again, the net effect, she says, once they return, is this reenactment of the old Jim Crow effect. So they don't succeed in escaping the discrimination that was outlawed by the voting rights law and the civil rights laws of the 1960s. So that's an education. Diane?
And you know, Rick, what you described, the Fugitive Slave Act, even before the Civil War, the Fugitive Slave Act sent out a notice throughout the land that any white person that knew about, heard about, saw anything that could mean that there was an escaped person that was enslaved had escaped, they had the responsibility to, it's like this stop, look, stop and question. And as I look at now, it's like the Ahmaud Arbery case where he's jogging, and we see this all the time. We saw it recently with the father and son that were looking at a house somewhere with their agent, and there's something about seeing a Black person and especially in these segregated communities. We see a Black person and it pops right into our head. They must be doing something wrong. Now, she had a lot of reasons that she called the police, but that happens all the time. And with Ahmaud Arbery, there's something that white people feel like if they see a Black person, they have the right. That's the same thing that happened with, was it in Florida? Yeah, I think it was in Florida with Trayvon Martin. You see a Black person and you something says to you, I can go and I can follow this person. I can ask this person. And it's like the Fugitive Slave Act, and it's so built in to white people that they have the right and responsibility to watch and be careful for Black people. It's still happening. And like, if you want to look at the new Jim Crow, I mean, it never ended. It started back in Fugitive Slave Act, the police, and it really never ended through the Black Codes, Jim Crow, and nothing has ever stopped it. And so now here we are with mass incarceration.
Well, it just goes to illustrate that the past is still present. The past is still present, and we owe this observation to James Baldwin way back in the 1960s when he was writing about America's civil rights movement at that time. And now here we are, 70 years later, at least I'm just doing the math, still experiencing these things. And people always want to say, well, hasn't there been progress? To which I say the progress has been superficial because the past is still present, just as you've said, Diane. I mean, this goes back to the pre-Civil War times, all the way up through the present, Trayvon Martin, and now, of course, tragically and criminally in the case of George Floyd. Tell me your thoughts, Pharaoh, about where we are today.
My thoughts on that, because that's something that people ask very frequently. It's a frequent talking point. I don't personally agree that it's accurate to say that progress is superficial when you look at the lens of history. But usually when people ask that, right, when they ask, has there been progress, there's usually a sort of unspoken, or sometimes not even intended, but the energy can still be there. The concept that in asking that, so you're asking if you've done enough progress. And the answer to that is definitely no. There's still much more to do. And that's what's most important to take away. Because when people ask, Hasn't there been progress? Yeah, there's objectively been progress, and that's good, but there's still so much wrong that needs to be corrected, and that's what needs to be taken away. So I think that that is the most, in my opinion, that is the most accurate way to sort of answer that question. Because when you look at what has changed and what has been in the past, it feels disingenuous to me to say that there hasn't been change or that the change has only been superficial. I think that in the same breath, though, there is so much that not even just at its core is similar, but even how it's dressed and how it's presented culturally is made blatantly and fully intentionally to represent the I would call objective evils of the past. So, for example, when we look at the modern prison industrial complex, and we can see how it directly ties to, a modern variation of slavery, taking advantage of the loophole that was left behind, and how slavery is no longer permitted within the United States. That's something that's true towards the soul of the prison industrial complex. But even on the outside, you look at the culture of certain prison facilities, like the Louisiana State Penitentiary, or it's called just the Angola State Prison. That's obvious. That's clear. It's literally built on the grounds of a plantation, and they still do plantation work. They call the guards the freemen, and they watch over the inmates. Like, it's very clear and direct in certain ways of how directly tied to these things stuff still is in the present.
Let me ask Pharaoh a question. Um, so we could disagree on whether or not the changes have been superficial. I think that the changes that have happened have only occurred because they had to happen. Just like there has been change.
Why did they have to happen?
World. They okay, let's take one for example. We had the civil rights movement,
right?
And out of that civil rights movement, we had all kind of images that were shown all over the world. And
Right.
because the United States still holds itself as the land of the free and the brave. And
Sure.
so when you see these images, the dogs, the cops with clubs, the fire hoses, and then the United States was held up around the world as totally mistreating its Black, supposed to be citizens.
But why does that have to change anything?
If the United States wants to stay in the League of Nations and not just stay, but to lead and
Sure.
to say that we are the epitome of righteousness. We're a righteous country. We are from sea to shining sea. And so there's all of this still going on behind the scenes. There's the every day we see the native population, that was a genocide.
Yes, but all of those standards that you're describing are things that have always been the case in the history of this country. This country isn't very old. So as long as this country has existed, those things have been the case. And that hasn't stopped those from being images of prestige, or, in a better sense, conflicting with images of prestige. When you look at the history of things like that, it's not like the idea of the genocide, like you just described, because it is objectively genocide, but it's not like that concept has universally always been panned as an evil thing. That context, historically speaking, is new. You have portraits describing what you just described, and they are aired in palaces and museums, and at the time of their making, historically, those were seen as acts of prestige and things to be seen as honorable or righteous. So the idea that you can say that those things are now viewed universally as evil acts, which I think they should be, I think most modern people would, that by itself is progress, because it's saying that that has to be something that has to change is not true. That has changed because of a shift of consciousness. That is not a universal thing. It's not like the butchering of the others and the different tribes or what have you has always been something that you have to hide, or always been something that has been pushed to the background. That used to be something that you lauded and you pushed to the front, and that was one of your declarations of honor.
Okay, I see that. I can see,
Okay.
but Rick, go ahead. Now I can see you want to
Yeah,
say.
yeah. Well, what I worry about is that when we talk about whether there's been progress or not, is that where there is still work to be done, it is in areas that are baked into our system. For instance, one of the things that really troubles me is the way public education is financed through our local municipal real estate taxes. Well, and that results and has resulted over the century in people rushing to places where the good schools are, rather than to equalize out the resources. And that is really a tough number. I don't know what it would take to take a jackhammer to that baked in policy and practice in our country.
Short of federal overhaul, I don't think it'd be possible. I mean, it could be done on the state level individually and I am not an economist, so I don't know how that would be done financially and how to properly redistribute that. But that's what it would take, at least on a state level, to just overhaul that system of how that is funded by the individual towns and cities and what have you, like you just described. That would have to be taxation for those areas might have to be lumped into a central fund and then distributed based on population.
Right.
But I don't know how that would be done, nor do I have the belief that that's something that would happen without an incredible fight and drive to push it. But you're right; those are some of the most difficult to tackle things that are left over from these systems that were built to uphold those differences.
But look at this, Rick, and look at this, Pharaoh. What we're looking at now is our economic system. And because we, over time, and these are the things that Pharaoh's probably thinking about, before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, discrimination based on race was a perfectly legal thing, just like slavery was a perfectly legal thing. It's never been illegal or even really pushed back, even lynching. We haven't even ever passed a lynching law.
I mean, lynching is murder and therefore is illegal, and that's always been extrajudicial. It's just that it was something that was more socially acceptable.
Well, but for whatever reason, it was acceptable.
It was socially acceptable.
Years and years from now, we might say that having an economic system where you can discriminate against people based on the amount of money that they have, but maybe by that time, I'm not saying we will, maybe by that time that will be a problem. When that becomes a problem, then segregation will fall and the school systems will change. But as long as we have an economic system that we say it's discrimination based on the amount of money that you have and what you can therefore afford is perfectly reasonable. So there's the wall behind which all of these things exist.
That's the right word. I agree with you, Diane. There is a wall there that is impossible to scale. And yet, the amazing, I shouldn't say and yet, and also African Americans have persevered and scaled that wall in many cases, but it's only through extraordinary kinds of effort that should not be required of anybody.
It shouldn't, but as I've thought about it, I mean, we talk about this a lot. I think that it is a role that African Americans, because we have to go all the way back. Why was there slavery? Why were certain people enslaved? And I think it's what Martin Luther King talked about and other people. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. So we look back 2,000 years ago, and Pharaoh and I talk about this all the time, the birth of Christ 2,000 years ago. And so what was also happening was the whole system of religion was starting to circle around and change. And so we moved from a belief in multiple gods to this notion of the one God. So we've got the birth of Christ, the religion changing from paganism to Christianity, and right around there, capitalism. All three of those things.
That's a massive skip.
All three of those things.
I just have to say, from a historical perspective,
at the same time,
jumping literally over 1,000 years.
2,000 years ago. So
my point is, you started that. The first thing you said was 2,000 years ago. Then the second thing, a few hundred after that, and then.
But look at this.
Significantly over 1,000 years after the second one.
But look at this though. When you've got those three things, they're starting up. They weren't full-fleshed, but they're starting up. They went on and so at that time, Christianity was really Catholicism. So that Catholicism went on for 1,000 years, all the way up. And right there in there also is the patriarchy. So all these things.
Patriarchy, and again, this is things that we have described. Patriarchy cannot be attributed to Christianity. It predates Christianity, but
it does. But I see where Diane's going, and I believe, which is that religion has had a very big impact in reinforcing things that already existed, like patriarchalism and slavery, but it also then legitimized it, not just at a societal level, Diane. I think what you're saying is that it enshrined it in divinity, in theology, in the hierarchies of religious institutions that gave approval to slavery and segregation.
So
I think there's definitely a historical example of that, especially in during the Spanish Reconquista, with papal bulls specifically dedicated to giving a theological precedent for the enslavement of non-Christians. But my point is that even though that example does exist specifically in the history of Christianity for that context, it's not as though the pre-Christian pagan society of the Romans, because that's what we're talking about here. If we're talking about the history and trend of Christianity, because that was the new state religion adopted by the empire. So even in that sense, it's not as though there was some sort of sacrosanct belief in the freedom of individuals. Slavery was obviously different in Roman history than we're talking about the later triangle trade, but we aren't even talking about the triangle trade yet. We're talking about the papal bull of Dum Diversus. It's still
that had to happen first.
It does happen first, but my point is that it's definitely an interesting point. We're talking about the reinforcement of a lot of these concepts and the redefining of a lot of these concepts, but I don't see these things as necessarily being origins of concepts like this, because it's all too interlinked for any of these things to be sort of seen as a unique proposition that was birthed.
It's the interlinking of them that had solidified them and made it so we're just now at the bottom of this. The first 1,000 years was all the way up until Martin Luther, and then Luther knocked on the door, opened up that can of worms, and the Catholic Church started to implode. So, and then we've come down another 1,000 years, and here we are looking at the breakup of the patriarchy finally. And so anything is possible now.
Well, don't stop with the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the white evangelical denominations in this country still maintain public support for what is called white Christian nationalism. And I think we're warming up to having that conversation next. I think
that's even more the case than Catholicism in the modern day.
No, absolutely. And
let's make that our next topic.
Let's do, because I have a bone to pick with my own Christian brothers and sisters on that score. Well, listen, so come back, everybody. This is just the first of several installments, and we're going to wrap it up now and invite you back for discussion about religion, Christianity, modern Christianity, modern Christianity in America at our next time. So let me just say bye for now and see you next time.